November 30th, Dave, last day of November every year, is the birthday of an extraordinary figure who really deserves far more attention than he gets, Winston Churchill.
Sure.
And you know, Churchill's a funny guy. He's interesting for so many reasons. He was, well, first of all, most people know him. He loves cigars. There's a size of cigar, the Churchill, right, named after him.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty great accomplishment in life if you can actually have a cigar named after you after you're gone. He was a true polymath in the sense of he had many different interests. He was well-read, deep knowledge of many different things. People forget this. Like, he painted, and he was actually he wasn't a world-class painter, but he was pretty good. And one of the things Churchill did is all these hobbies he had, he would then write about his interests, and his writings about them were often fascinating. So he would paint, and then he would write an essay on the love of painting.
It's an Aristotle in his own time, right? I mean,
very much.
Aristotle. I also wonder, I didn't know that about painting, about him and painting. Mm-hmm. And I also wonder, George W. Bush, after he left the White House, mm-hmm. he took to painting. That became his passion, his hobby. Right. And I wonder if there was any influence from Churchill.
I don't know. There would be something interesting to find out. Churchill loved history. He loved philosophy. He was largely a self-educated man. He not only loved the works of Shakespeare, he memorized them. Actors, when he would go to live performances, they would get frustrated because Churchill would sit in the front row and he would be reciting the lines, right, along with the actors in the play.
It's when a crowd is singing along with the musician and clapping on stage.
Except for him, he's reciting Shakespeare, by memory. And so here's this man of tremendous importance. Of course, he is pivotal. He's key in the Allied victory in World War II. I mean, it's certainly very arguable that without Churchill, the modern world would have been very different. There's no guaranteeing that Nazi Germany and its allies would have been defeated. Germany came close to defeating Churchill and Churchill's army. And Churchill, he said once about the Royal Air Force, what was his line? Never before was so much owed to so few, because the Royal Air Force had been literally shot down to almost nothing. There were only a few planes and pilots left, and yet they're what kept the German blitzkrieg at bay and allowed the English to kind of regather, rearm, reorganize. Mm-hmm. And when I think of Churchill, every year on November 30th, if at all possible, I try to carve out a little time to smoke a cigar and drink a glass of whiskey or something in honor of Churchill. By the way, here's another fun fact about Churchill. Many people don't know. Churchill drank alcohol all day long, every day. He always had, very often he would pour either some wine, sometimes some brandy, and he'd pour like a bunch of seltzer water, and he'd dilute it down, but he would be sipping alcohol from morning to night till the time he went to bed. And I kind of joke about it. Churchill, the person he reminds me of the most in terms of his energy and his activity is Alexander Hamilton.
Okay.
They have a lot in common this way, that they have what seems to be like the energy of 10 men packed into the body of one person. Like, it's amazing how much this guy just did and wrote and accomplished. And I actually think that alcohol is a depressant. I think he needed that to kind of bring him down to the level of ordinary people so he could interact with people.
People said the same thing about Ulysses Grant.
That's right.
I mean, the guy just was constantly ready for a fight.
Right.
Always ready for the battle, and the whiskey brought him down. It's almost as if Churchill was this combination of Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant, right? The Lincoln the thinker and Grant the fighter.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. He reflects widely and deeply. He meditates upon permanent questions of human nature, and at the same time, the changing world around him. I mean, think of this guy. He's born in the 1870s when the Industrial Revolution really is transforming everything. One of the things that deeply concerns Churchill throughout his entire life is the sheer mass scale of modern life. Cities are huge. Businesses and corporations are gigantic. Factories, right? They don't turn out 2 or 3 or 4 products a day. They turn out millions of products a day, right?
The assembly line.
All that, right? And his concern was that the individual somehow gets lost in the sheer scale of modern life. And he also, in fact, he writes some of his most beautiful writing is on how modern productivity and the mass scale of the modern way of life translates into war. Ancient war used to be hand-to-hand combat. Things like courage really mattered a lot when you're out there literally 2 feet away from your enemy. Right. You both have a sword in your hand, and if one gets scared and runs away, that's a big deal. Whereas in modern war,
you're controlling a drone from 300,000 miles or from 3,000 miles away.
Exactly, and that terrifies Churchill.
Yeah,
like he really
it should
as it should. He in one of his essays he describes a scene of this is in North Africa, and he witnessed this there as a young soldier. These tribal native people are running at the British Army, and the British Army has these huge mounted machine guns. And from hundreds of yards away, they're shooting these guys down in huge numbers. And he describes the guys running the machine gun. It's a team of men, as if they're in a factory, right? They're taking care of a piece of machinery. They're cooling it, they're lubricating it, right? They're doing all that. And meanwhile, they're blowing away these guys who are 800 yards away. They can barely even see them. And Churchill sees that happening. And it worries him.
They reproduced that scene in that Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai. Did you ever see that?
I did not.
So there's a scene where it takes place. I can't remember if it was right after the American Revolutionary War, the American Civil War.
Okay.
But Tom Cruise was a great general played a great general in the U.S. Army.
Right.
And ends up going over to help, I'm guessing it's the Japanese. The U.S. Army rents him out to the Japanese to introduce them to these modern warfare machine guns.
Right.
These turning,
like the Gatling gun.
Yes.
Things like that.
With long strands of ammo and everything else. And he goes in and he's teaching them how to use these against the samurai,
right,
who are trying to protect the old way of life in Japan. And they'll set the Gatling gun up on a hill, and the samurai will come charging, and they're just mowing him down. And he ends up learning more and ends up becoming a samurai and fighting against that. And it's a whole interesting story. But,
that's the reason
they use that analogy. I mean, they use that idea of modern warfare versus the old samurai techniques.
Right. Churchill, he's a very reflective, thoughtful mind. And when I think about his career, of course, he's a great war hero. Really, his career can be summed up. He gave everything to fighting against the most advanced forms of progressivism. Because all the murderous measures, I mean, in World War II, his primary enemy is Hitler's Nazi Germany.
Sure.
That was, at the time, the most advanced form of progressivism. And no matter how you measure it, Germany in the 1930s had more scientists, researchers, medical doctors, as well as academic doctorates, PhDs. The Germans invent the PhD degree.
Sure.
They had more universities, more colleges per population. I mean, they were a highly educated, highly advanced in the modern sense of these things.
And they had developed the most robust bureaucry
that is correct.
The world had ever seen, right? They put all of those highly educated, highly qualified, I put in air quotes, but highly qualified people in charge of these bureaucratic agencies.
People, later people like Franz Kafka will come along and write novels basically depicting what it means to live under these gigantic bureaucracies filled with all these nameless, right, anonymous, faceless bureaucrats who control every aspect of your life. And you're right, the Germans perfected that more than anyone. People around the world, including Americans, who wanted to study progressivism, study the progressive science of bureaucracy. Where did they go to study? They went to Germany, right? And they went and they studied with German scholars, but they also studied the actual German bureaucracy so that they could see it in operation and how it works and how to come back and build similar things in the United States. And that's what Churchill is going up against, this highly advanced form of progressivism, which includes all the central planning. The Nazi bureaucratic regime takes control of education. They take control of religion. They take control of healthcare, of housing. The very term fascism means, on paper, there's still property rights. On paper, a business owner has a title to his business. But the reality is, central planners in the government bureaucracies, they're telling the businesses, here's what you're going to do. You're going to start producing all these things we need for the war effort. You're going to convert your machinery and your factories to make the things we need, or we'll take it away from you, right? So how much do those titles really mean? That's Churchill's focus in World War II. And as soon as he defeats Hitler and Nazi Germany, Churchill looks over at Russia. And he sees the specter of Soviet communism. He gives a famous speech in Missouri, here in the United States, in which he announces an Iron Curtain has fallen across Europe. And that Iron Curtain is the line that is dividing free countries from the totalitarian tyranny of Soviet communism. And that, too, right, is the most advanced form of progressivism at that time.
Sure.
If you were a progressive in the world and you're looking around saying who's really run with these ideas of bureaus and bureaucracies and central planning and government regulation and subsidy and control, and where's the model for that? Nazi Germany and then communist Soviet Union. And Churchill is pushing back against that his entire life. And I think for Americans who love freedom and Americans who, like our members in the Vino Veritas Society, who know there's something rotten at the core of progressivism. There's something evil there. There is a hunger for power and control that is not good. It's unjust. For those kinds of people, studying the life and the career of Winston Churchill can be really instructive.
Absolutely. Well, and here's what's interesting about history. We find throughout history, and quite often because of war, people tend to be remembered in either pairs or in groups, right? You think about, I guess you could put Lincoln with a whole lot of people, whether it's a Jefferson Davis or any of the others, Calhoun,
Roger Taney, Stephen Douglas.
Right. We tend to remember people in pairs. And we remember as a pair, I think, quite often. Sometimes they're adversarial pairs. Sometimes they're partners. And we remember Churchill and FDR quite often together. They led the Allied army against Nazism and against progressive fascism and everything else. And yet we can look at these two and there's some stark differences between the two of them. And I think that makes for an interesting comparison, not even just comparing personalities, but comparing what's important. While Churchill is sitting there studying all of these ideas of individual rights and we have to fight this war and we're giving more and more power to the government in order to do it, but I'm still concerned about the individual's right and individual rights and freedoms. FDR's sitting over here, hesitant to even engage in the war until Pearl Harbor. And he's thinking about, how do I grow government? How do I make the individual more in tune with what the government needs and doing for the government rather than the opposite? And I think that's a stark pretty stark contrast.
Yeah, I agree. You know, we have made the argument before, and I think it's worth repeating. This is an important idea, and we are in the business of ideas after all. I mean, we love wine, which is why we have vino in our name, but we also love truth, and,
right.
and we are students of ideas. We think about ideas and study them, and this idea we have proposed, which is the only reason progressivism turned out differently in places like Germany in the 1930s and 40s and Russia and the larger Soviet Union over the course of the 20th century. The only reason it was very bad there and it was less bad here in the United States is because we had a particularly wisely designed constitution, which they did not. If the Germans had something like the United States Constitution and was their government was constituted that way, that would have slowed down the implementation of progressive fascism. You know, here in the United States, I mean, there are a lot of examples, constitutional examples you could point to. Things like the United States Senate. In any given election cycle, only 1/3 of the senators are actually up for election, right? They're staggered. Devices like that make it difficult, not impossible, but difficult for something like progressivism or progressive fascism to just come sweeping in and transform the government overnight. We have all these interesting checks and balances that every school kid should be learning, right?
Right. Well, we've talked about that in previous podcasts, right?
Yeah.
We talked about the differences between the early 30s and the late 30s on the Supreme Court when it came to FDR. FDR
Right.
was trying to push all of these things through in terms of governing how farmers farm and how businesses operate. And the Supreme Court in the early to mid 30s said you can't do that.
That's right.
That's not how this works. It was not until the late 30s where he had really started to.
In fact, the Supreme Court was actively striking down all these early New Deal programs. And when you look back just one generation before that, Woodrow Wilson, really the greatest innovator for progressivism,
Sure.
I would argue, in American history. When Wilson looked at the American founding, looked at the Constitution and the constitutional design of government, the single most important thing that he attacked, that he wanted to get rid of, was the constitutional separation of powers. He thought that was the grandest mistake, the greatest error
Right.
that the founders made, precisely because he recognized you cannot just come sweeping in with progressive fascism and transform the regime instantly. And that's what he wanted to be able to have. He actually wanted for the things that happened in Germany and the Soviet Union, he wanted that to be possible here in the United States,
Sure.
which is why he spent his life railing against the separation of powers and trying to undermine them any way that he could.
You know, it would be an interesting exercise, and we definitely don't have time for it on this podcast, and I would suggest we would have to have some fairly serious exploration time before we ever did it. But it would be an interesting experiment to play out what would have happened if Churchill was an American and FDR was a Brit.
Wow.
And if Churchill was our president at that time, how would the American army or the American military have responded to Nazi Germany?
Yeah.
And where would the UK be today?
Yeah.
If during that time, I mean, if we're all being honest, FDR, it wasn't that he despised a lot of those ideas.
Correct.
He was responding to a threat against America, and that threat was based on the actual foundational beliefs of this country.
Well, here I'll put it in bigger, broader terms, and this is a fascinating question for American progressives, really over the past century, including today. There is a long tradition within the progressive movement. So I'm going all the way back to Wilson, to FDR Democrats, New Dealer Democrats, and liberal progressive Democrats later in the 50s and the 60s and 70s. There's a long tradition of opposition to communism abroad.
Sure.
Opposition to radical National Socialism. And the question I've always had is, why? what is it you object to? If you're a progressive, liberal in the modern New Deal meaning of liberal Democrat, don't you agree with the foundational ideas of whether it's fascism in Italy and Germany, or it's communism in the Soviet Union or China or some other place? The basic premise of those regimes is progressivism. Right. It is
central planning,
central control. Right. And there are slight differences in policies and priorities, but in the end, if you have the boot of a government soldier on your neck and he's taking your house, you don't really care if it's called fascism or it's called communism or socialism, right? All you know is you have a boot on your neck and you just lost your house. In the case of FDR, in his very last State of the Union address, which he delivered in 1944, this is a year before he dies in 1945, he concluded his speech in Congress by saying that, now this is right near the end of World War II. And he's confident that we're going to win.
Right.
And he says, picture this is the President of the United States. And he says the great threat that is arising within America in 1944, there are these groups of people out there, they call themselves conservatives. Sometimes they claim to be constitutionalists. They wrap themselves in the Constitution and they criticize government programs in the name of the Constitution. But really, he makes it clear, really what they are, just selfish, greedy people who don't care about others. That's what they really are. And then he says at the very end of his speech, if these conservatives are allowed, notice that word, or if they are allowed to become influential and take control in the United States, then even though we will have defeated fascism in Europe, fascism will be victorious here in the United States. He is saying conservatives are fascists. He is saying conservatives are Nazis, right? Those are the fascists we're fighting on battlefields abroad. We're fighting Nazis. And now here's where it gets really interesting when you start to piece this apart. He's calling us.
Right.
He's calling us fascists.
Right.
We're conservatives. We're constitutionalists. We defend things like private property and equal protection under the law and individual liberty. These are things that we stand for at the Vino Veritas Society. This is how confused not just FDR, but millions of progressives are, to think that constitutional freedom, or a free society within a constitutional, to think that that's fascism, when the truth is, Mr. Franklin Roosevelt, he was a fascist.
Right.
And I'm not saying that as some, emotional, derogatory term. No, I mean it quite literally.
You're not saying he's a Nazi.
No,
you're saying he's a fascist.
He is a fascist.
That's the clear difference,
That's right?
And here's what's crazy is that statement was made nearly 80 years ago, 76 years ago.
Right.
Almost 77 as of next year.
Right.
And in all of that time, over that entire period, it's stuck.
Yeah.
They're still saying the same thing, and it's evolved from you're a fascist in the same way you just defined FDR as a fascist to now you're a Nazi, right? So the two have just become totally intertwined. And today, if progressives everywhere say, if you believe in constitutional freedom, you're a fascist Nazi.
Yeah.
And it's bewildering that
it makes no sense
that has lasted for 75 plus years.
Yeah. Fascism, by definition, is government control, government central planning of private property, especially businesses, telling businesses what they will do and what they will not do, regulating them to the hilt. And that is what progressivism is. That's what the New Deal was in the United States. I mean, from great big things, telling factories what they were going to produce, how many units they were going to produce, down to small single proprietor, a guy owns a little dry cleaning shop, telling the dry cleaner, here is how much you shall charge to press a pair of men's trousers. You will not charge more and you will not charge less. You will charge what we tell you to charge.
Or the example we've talked about on the farms where they said you can grow this many heads of lettuce, but don't you dare grow one that you're going to eat yourself.
Yeah.
You cannot grow. There was a show. This just made me think of it. There's this show on True TV called Impractical Jokers.
I know of it.
You know the show.
Yeah, my kids love it. Yeah.
And they were talking about a story the other day where one of them called his mother using an accent and said, "We've been made aware you have a farm in your backyard." She says, "No, I have a little garden. It's not a farm." He says, "You have more than 5 plants, and to the government in New Jersey, that's considered a farm. And we're entitled to 20% of what you produce. And you have to start giving us 1 tomato every quarter."
Yep.
I want 1 tomato. You have to ship and mail us 1 tomato from your garden. And she's freaking out. How can you? And I'm sitting there thinking, He's not making this up.
Right.
He thinks he's playing a joke on his mom, but that's reality. I mean, that's actually what has been happening since the 40s.
Absolutely, and has gone on for decades. And there's a, I don't know if it's funny or sad, but there's an aspect to that farming story that demonstrates why central planning always fails. Because the central planners can never have adequate knowledge over the things they're trying to plan. Sure. So when they plan, they actually, the regulations usually were not according to like heads of lettuce or grains of wheat. It was by acreage. They would say, you may plant and cultivate X number of acres, no more, no less. And what the bureaucrats didn't know about was 2 things. 2 technologies were advancing rapidly. One was the perfection of the internal combustion engine and tractors. So now with tractors, farmers could cultivate land much more efficiently than being out there with their oxen or horse or whatever they used to use. Even more importantly was developments in the realm of fertilizers. All of a sudden, these farmers are growing far more wheat on 1 acre than they ever had before, or corn or milo or whatever it is they're growing. The bureaucrats aren't aware, right? This is a very fluid situation that things are changing, and they have these blanket regulations and policies. And so even though they're trying to decrease the supply of farm products in order to drive prices up because they've promised the farmers that they can get more money when they sell their products. But in truth, the supply is actually going up. Right. There's more wheat is actually being grown because of all these advancements in farming technologies.
You hit on something really interesting and really important that I don't think most Americans, even most conservatives, think about. And that is central planners can't accurately understand what is important to every group of people.
That's right.
Right? And we've become such a progressive society that even conservatives, when they get into office, whether you're Eisenhower or Reagan or Bush or Trump, anywhere in between, and they are all to varying degrees playing in the progressive sandbox that we've been talking about the last few weeks.
Right.
And so they're being expected to act like a leader, as the progressives like to say. And here's what becomes interesting. And here's where they end up getting defined as fascists. They get defined as fascists because it's not that they are actually saying, we want you to do this and you to do this, and we're gonna govern the entire country and we're gonna tell you how to run your business. But they're being expected to make decisions on behalf of everybody. And they're not making decisions that progressives like. They're not making the orders and the rules that progressives want out of their leader. So they're saying, you're not telling that person to do what I want, but you are telling this person to go be this and go do that. And you have to go to college or you have to go find a job, right? I mean, even to that level, let's just go back to that. You have to go find a job. You need to be a productive member of society. Can't tell me to be a productive member of society. you're a fascist. You're
Right.
making me work. You're making me be productive. But that's literally how the progressives look at this. They say you can't tell anybody what to do with their life. And they don't think about it in terms of, all he's saying is, if you want to live, you got to go be productive.
Right.
That's freedom. That's being a virtuous citizen, like we like to talk about. And that's where the fascist claim comes from.
And think of that contradiction there, right? The progressives will say you can't tell people how to live, and yet that's what progressivism is. Progressivism at its heart is control.
Right.
Planning. It is precisely telling other people how they're going to use their own property, how they're going to run their businesses, how they're going to access health care, all those kinds of things. Back to, we opened by talking about Churchill. There was an election in 1945, and he gave a speech on radio, as a radio address. And it was actually controversial. Many people, Churchill loses. He is not reelected prime minister after the war. And many people point to this speech as a pivotal moment. But what he says in this speech is absolutely true. He points out that socialism quickly transforms into total planning. The bureaucrats have to be the arch planners, arch business controllers. They're in charge of everything. And when the government gets in charge of anything, you cannot allow dissent. It doesn't work, right? Because you need everybody. If you hope for your plans to work at all, everyone has to do what they're told to do. You can't have angry dissidents out there saying, I don't like this. I oppose these orders. I think the government is, full of hooey. And so very quickly that leads into restrictions on speech. That leads to restrictions of liberty. And how do you enforce restrictions on liberty? With some form of Gestapo, some form of a police state that is going to start monitoring what people may and may not say. And Churchill was roundly criticized for that. And yet he's absolutely right. That is the logic of socialism. It leads to some form of a Gestapo police state.
And what ends up happening is the people who agree with the leader end up thinking they have a right to act as Gestapo to other citizens.
Yes.
Right? And you start to have people begin acting as if I have a right to interfere in your life. I have a right to your property. I have a right.
Because they assume they're on the moral high ground, right? They assume, well, I'm doing all this planning and controlling for your benefit, for your good. I'm making sure you have health care and you have education, you have housing. Therefore, it's right for me to control people. Maybe I got to put some in jail. Maybe I got to silence some. That's okay because it's for the greater good.
I'll give you the perfect example. This morning, I was getting coffee, and in the coffee shop, all of a sudden, I'm trying to order, and there are two people behind me screaming at each other. Literally screaming at each other. Because one guy pulled his mask down to take a sip of his coffee while he was waiting for his other drink. And a guy goes, hey, if you're going to drink that, get outside. Not an employee.
Right.
Another person waiting for their drink.
Right.
And was loud and ready to be violent over this. And the other guy said, I'm just taking a sip. No, you can't do that. I mean, it was, I know I have the moral high ground and this is what the rules are.
That's right.
And we're going to get the same thing when we, just apply COVID to all of this. We're going to get the same thing when vaccines come out.
Right.
Did you get the vaccine? We're tracking you. If you didn't get the vaccine, you can't fly. If you didn't get the vaccine, you can't go here. You can't be here. We're going to give you tickets. We're going to give you all of these things. And we don't know what's best for people.
Yeah.
We don't know what their circumstances. We don't know what their situation is. And you can't centrally plan everybody's life because every individual is so different.
It's absolutely right. A contemporary example here dealing with COVID, this government bureaucrat, Anthony Fauci, who has won many progressive Americans celebrate him. Many non-progressive Americans are tired of hearing him. But here's the important thing. Anthony Fauci, I'm sure he's a very smart guy. I have no doubt about that. Very intelligent mind. But here's something Anthony Fauci cannot know. He cannot know what is a priority to me or millions of other Americans. How could he possibly know that? What he can know in these circumstances, here's where COVID is most likely to be spread, and here's how it's spread, and here are the kinds of people who are most at risk if they get COVID, and here are people who are at very little risk. He can know that through research. Right. What he cannot know is if I have one opportunity right now, today, to go see some family members that I might not get to see again, is it more important to me to stay safe and just be isolated so I don't get COVID? Or is it more valuable to me to go see those family members, knowing I might get exposed? Whatever the answer is, it's up to me to decide, right? That's my choice, and there's no way that Anthony Fauci can make it for me.
Ask Denver Mayor Michael Hancock about that.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? I mean, this is a guy who's saying, for everybody's sake, you need to stay home and not travel. But for me, my priority is to see my family in Mississippi, no matter what. I'm willing to take that risk for me.
Well, you know, Dave, he has family. And being with family is important to him. And how could we really understand something like that, right?
Cuomo would agree with him.
Yeah.
And Cuomo would get to go see his family, but certainly doesn't allow anybody else. And
this is another piece that always attends central planning experiments. The people who make the plans always exempt themselves.
Sure.
They ignore it themselves. They think they're above. They're planning life for everybody else. This surely doesn't apply to them. Here's the other piece of this that's really important. I've been thinking about this fellow, Anthony Fauci, and when news of COVID first came out, now many months ago, is it just me or does 2020 seem like the longest year in the history of years? Like, it's just, when I think of what was going on back in February and March,
it seems like a lifetime ago.
Seems like a lifetime ago.
It does.
So when I heard about COVID, I did this radical thing. I'm a free man. I'm a free citizen, and I did something very radical. I did not contact Jared Polis or Donald Trump or Andrew Cuomo or Anthony Fauci. I contacted nobody in government. I sent an email to my physician.
Right.
And I said, what's up with this this COVID, this coronavirus, right? Tell me about it. And we had an exchange, and she sent out this she put together some information, sent it to all of her patients, and it was helpful. And I think to myself, now what scientific medical research does Anthony Fauci have access to that my physician does not? And the answer is none. My physician has access to any of the medical research that Anthony Fauci does. What's the difference?
At least we hope. I mean, there always is that possibility within a progressive government that because
that's true.
They want certain things to be taken in a certain way. They hide certain information. The government is doing extra research and funding research grants that we don't want that news getting out, so we're going to protect.
You are right about that. It's always possible. I'm thinking of research that is published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, that kind of stuff. Any physician has access to it. For that matter, you and I have access to it. We can go read those articles. So what's the big difference between my physician and I really like her. Like the only reason I ever go see her is if I'm sick or something like that. So that part's not great. But I like her personality. She's kind of fun. And Anthony Fauci. And it's this. My relationship with my physician, everything between us is voluntary. It's voluntary. The most my physician can ever do to me is offer suggestion.
Right.
That's it. She can say, hey, Tom, I think you should take this medicine, or I think you should have this medical procedure done. That's my advice.
Right.
And then it's always up to me to decide whether I actually want to do that or not. She has no legalized power over me, no legalized control. She can't make me do anything.
Right.
Anthony Fauci is part of the government. He's part of an apparatus that can actually issue regulations, issue commands, issue orders. Those in the government can do that. It's not voluntary. It's not a mutually agreeable kind of arrangement. That's why the power we grant to those in government should always be very limited and closely scrutinized. However that power is exercised, precisely because it's so dangerous, precisely because they can legally make you, command you, force, coerce you to do something you don't want to do in a way your own physician can't, and neither can any neighbor, any friend, any family member. They can't make you do anything.
You just described the basis, the very foundation of the hatred for Donald Trump from the progressive left. The hatred of Donald Trump isn't that he didn't disclose his taxes. The hatred isn't that he plays golf. The hatred isn't that he is not always appropriate in the way he talks or he mocks people.
For the record, I wish more politicians played more golf. I wish they spent more time playing more golf, because then they would spend less time taking my money.
Sure. And the reality is, I mean, it's funny because the progressive left never said a word about how much golf and a basketball Obama was playing.
Right.
And now Trump does about the same, and oh my God, it's the end of the world. But the hatred isn't in that foundation. The hatred is, we want the person who's going to make the decisions we want, who's going to regulate us in the way we want to be regulated. And if you regulate us in the way we want to be regulated, you're a hero. If you regulate us in the way we don't want to be regulated, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi, you're the worst human being on the face of the planet. And that's why every single Republican president since Eisenhower has gone through an impeachment proceeding.
Right.
Because at their very foundation, they are not making the decisions that the progressive left wants them to make on behalf of the country.
And let's be clear, regardless of results, the results don't actually matter. Case in point, this year, in 2020, just within this year, there's a tremendous study in contrast between Trump as president and Cuomo as governor of New York.
Right.
Huge contrast. Trump, as president, recognized the constitutional limitations of the powers of the president. And he was quite open about this. He said, I'm not going to issue. I mean, he did a few things, right? He stopped some travel from China. And things like that. But internally, within the United States, he said, look, this is something for you in the various states to deal with under the Constitution. And he was absolutely right about that. And the Constitution is wisely designed that way, because the truth is, what's going on, the challenges on the ground in South Dakota are very different than the challenges on the ground in Florida, which are different than the challenges in New York and California and Colorado and right, all these. So the idea of the Constitution was, you and your respective states, you deal with it the way that you think best.
And as a federal government, he still tried to, right or wrong, and some of us think it's wrong, but he still tried to provide some resources to the states, right? He said, I'm not going to tell you how to use it,
right,
but here are resources.
Yes.
We're going to make sure as a nation we have enough ventilators. We're going to make sure that you have some federal funding to be spent.
And this leads right into my point. So the federal government under President Trump makes available this gigantic floating hospital. It's a Navy ship.
Right.
And I don't remember the number of beds, but it's a huge thing. And the ship sailed into the port in New York, and there it was. And the president said, if you need it, use it. That's why it's there. Instead, and delegating, or really not delegating, respecting the centers of power in the state and local communities. You folks figure out how you want to handle this. The contrast to that is the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, who is a progressive. He's a central planner. And he said, number one, he wanted to do everything himself. He wanted to plan even though he could not know what people wanted or needed. And number two, he didn't want to use those federal resources because he in no way wanted any appearance. He didn't want any credit going to Trump for anything. Right. So that big naval hospital sat there empty.
Right.
And instead, the governor issued executive orders and commanded huge numbers of sick elderly people into nursing homes. And the results were disastrous. Tens of thousands of older people in nursing homes are now dead who they don't have to be dead other than that failed experiment in central planning.
And those who were there first weren't given the choice to leave. He didn't call the nursing homes and the families of these people and say, hey, we're going to be putting some sick people in these nursing homes.
Right.
If you don't want to be there, now is the time. He just put them in.
Right.
I lost my great aunt over it. My mom's aunt who grew up in the apartment. My mom grew up in the apartment next door to them. I mean, they literally shared a floor of a building in Brooklyn. She was in one of those nursing homes. And her son, my cousin, was in Florida. He has a condo he keeps in Florida for the winter. People leave New York when they're older and don't want to spend the winters there. And he was there, and his mom was in the nursing home. There was nothing we could do. She was not given an opportunity to leave. They kept her in, and 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, she's gone.
Yeah.
And then we couldn't have a funeral.
Right.
They had mass funerals for all of these, the George Floyds and everybody else, but you want to have a funeral for somebody who died in that nursing home? No. You can't even come out to New York right now. We're going to quarantine you for 2 weeks. You got to make it a whole trip if you're going to do that. There's also another.
So I just want to repeat here this big point that we're making. The how upside down things are. The people who truly are fascists, or the people who act like fascists, centralized power, central government planning, control over other people's lives, liberty, property, businesses. They don't get called fascists. The actual fascists, the progressives today, they call fascists those who defend any semblance of freedom, any semblance of self-government. Right? We say, well, we want people to make their own choices, do with their own property what they want, do with their own lives what they want, take the risks or avoid whatever risks each individual chooses on their own, and we get called fascists, right? It makes no sense at all.
There was another example I wanted to use in addition to Cuomo. This news came out this week, and I thought it just further proves the point. In Los Angeles, so money got distributed to states, and those states distributed the money to counties and cities and things along those lines. The money that went to some of the money that went to Los Angeles to help them, the federal assistance that went out. The city of Los Angeles, despite an in-house communications team within the mayor's office, spent $2.9 million of taxpayer money to hire celebrities to go on Instagram and buy ads on Instagram to tell people to wear masks.
There you go.
At what point does that become just comical? Right? Do you need to pay $2.9 million to celebrities to remind us to wear masks?
I thought you were going to say they spend it on hookers and drugs.
Well,
that might have been money better spent.
Maybe the celebrities only cost $900,000 and there's $2 million that's just being laundered through this.
Yeah.
It's insane. And yet those are the people who are getting recognized. Those are the people who are getting idealized as you're the great leader, right? You're such a great leader. You got these celebrities to tell everybody what I believe in.
Well, one of the things we're doing as an organization, the Vino Veritas Society, is helping others understand what fascism is, what socialism is, what communism is, that all of these are just variations of progressive central planning. Earlier in our discussion, you used the term progressive fascism, and that's right. Fascism is a form of progressivism, and as more Americans come to understand what all these forms of control have in common, we got to start calling people out. We got to start, correctly applying the labels. People who act like fascists, the central planners, the progressives, they should be called fascists repeatedly. And if anyone doesn't want to be called a fascist, well then, don't be a progressive. Don't be a central planner. Don't advocate for those kinds of control.
And that goes for Republicans too. And I say that in a very specific way. I don't mean that Republicans in government shouldn't want the best for their communities and everything else. I think all too often, conservatives who know better tend to fold to the threats of the progressive mob.
Agreed.
They say they're so intense to expect me to go out and save people. I know I shouldn't do this,
right?
But I'm going to.
They cave into the pressure,
right? And it's one of those things that, you know, there's a lot of people out there who love Donald Trump, and if you're going to take anything from what he's done in his 4 years in office, like we said, we don't know what's going to happen next, and it's looking like Joe Biden's going to be president. But if you're going to take anything from the last 4 years of Trump's presidency, is things like COVID. Trump got pressured every single day,
right,
to national mandates on masks, national mandates on closing bars and restaurants, national mandates on all of these things, and he just said no.
Yeah,
I mean, it was almost his own form of revolution, even though he's in government, right? It was I'm just going to say no, and I'm going to do things the way I know is right, and I'm not going to cave to your pressure. And there can be a lot of things that people can say they don't like about Donald Trump. But as far as that's concerned, he knew a lot of times when to say no.
I think that's right. And I'm going to tie this back to, as we kind of wind down here, to our discussion of Churchill. One of the things that Churchill saw in the course of World War II. Now, it was a great and terrible war. Britain was nearly destroyed. It required victory for the British, required extensive sacrifice and devotion to the war cause. And the government in Britain did many things that it did not ordinarily do during peacetime. And it terrified Churchill to see socialists look at those what were supposed to be temporary war measures, control over resources and things that they needed soldiers and guns and bombs and tanks and all of that. The socialists were looking at those temporary measures and already planning how to make them permanent. They wanted that permanent government control. And Churchill was pushing back. No. These are temporary measures because of this extreme, dire national emergency we're in. COVID today is kind of the equivalent. It's not nowhere near the emergency that World War II was for British, but it's a kind of crisis. The Latin root of the word crisis means turning.
Sure.
A crisis means we're going to go one way or the other after this. And the great danger of the incoming administration is that they're going to use COVID to justify what will look like at first temporary measures, and then those temporary measures after 6 months, after a year, after 4 years are no longer temporary.
Right.
They're just permanent additions and expansions of government control.
And we can look through history and we can see how that's happened even in modern, very recent history. 9/11 happened.
That's right.
And we created the Office of Homeland Security.
That's right.
And we thought the TSA stuff and the security at airports would be temporary, right? We're gonna have some increased security at airports. Now it's gotten
almost 20 years later,
and it's more advanced, and it's takes longer, and now you pay to get extra access, so you don't have to wait in such long lines. It's turned into a whole business in and of itself, rather than going back to what it was before.
Yeah.
These things don't go away. And with John Kerry coming in as the climate czar, I guarantee you that office, if Biden ends up getting into office and John Kerry gets this position of climate czar and creates this new bureaucratic agency, it's never going away.
It's why we need guardians of the American idea more now than ever before, which is why the Vino Veritas Society exists.
Nos somos custodes.
Till next time.